The women in Willow Creek had a habit of lowering their voices whenever Silas Carter's name came up. Some said the blacksmith had no heart. Others insisted he had simply buried it beneath years of smoke, iron, and silence. No one could remember the last time they had seen him laugh. The town's postmaster, Samuel Reed, often joked that delivering letters to Silas was the easiest part of his job. The man never had visitors, never received more than a handful of bills, and never stayed in town long enough for conversation. So when a letter arrived announcing that Silas Carter had requested a mail-order bride, the entire town assumed it was some sort of mistake. 3 weeks later, Eleanor Brooks stepped down from the stagecoach with a single worn suitcase in one hand and quiet determination in her eyes. She had traveled farther than she had ever imagined, leaving behind a crowded eastern town where every day looked exactly like the one before it. She hadn't come west searching for romance. She had come looking for a place where a person could begin again. As the stagecoach disappeared down the dusty road, Samuel Reed approached her with a polite smile. "You must be Miss Brooks." "I am." He hesitated before speaking again. "Mr. Carter should be here shortly." There was something unusual in his tone, as though he wanted to say more but thought better of it. A few minutes later, the steady sound of horse hooves echoed across the street. A tall man guided a dark wagon toward the station. His broad shoulders were covered with soot-stained work clothes, and his rough hands rested lightly on the reins. His expression revealed nothing, neither warmth nor irritation, only the calm, unreadable face of someone who had long ago stopped expecting much from the world. Their eyes met for only a moment. "Miss Brooks?" he asked. "Yes. I'm Silas Carter." Without another word, he lifted her suitcase into the wagon. He didn't offer his hand to help her climb aboard. Eleanor didn't wait for one. The ride toward his property stretched nearly 2 hours through quiet forests and rolling hills. The silence between them never felt awkward. It simply existed. Eleanor watched the landscape while Silas kept his attention on the road ahead. Eventually she asked, "Have you lived here long?" "My whole life. Nothing more." She smiled faintly. He wasn't trying to be rude. He simply answered only what had been asked. When the blacksmith's home finally appeared beyond the trees, Eleanor understood why people described it as lonely. The workshop stood beside the house, its chimney sending dark smoke into the cool autumn sky. The yard was spotless. Firewood had been stacked with perfect precision. Every fence rail stood straight. Everything was cared for. Nothing felt lived in. Inside, the house reflected the man who owned it. A sturdy wooden table. 2 plain chairs. A cast-iron stove polished until it gleamed. Shelves arranged with exact order. No paintings. No curtains. No flowers. No photographs. The place resembled a building waiting for life instead of a home already filled with it. Silas placed her suitcase beside a bedroom door. "That room is yours." She nodded. He continued in the same calm voice. "Breakfast is at sunrise. Dinner after work. The well is behind the house. The pantry is full enough for winter. My workshop stays locked after dark." Each sentence sounded more like a list than a conversation. When he finished, he looked at her. "Any questions?" Eleanor slowly turned in a circle, studying the quiet room before smiling gently. "Just one." Silas waited. When was the last time this house smelled like fresh bread instead of hot iron? For the first time, something almost invisible crossed his face. Not a smile. Not surprise. Only the faintest pause. "I don't remember," he answered honestly. Then he stepped outside, closing the door behind him. Eleanor stood alone in the silent house. She opened her suitcase and carefully placed a folded blue tablecloth across the empty dining table. It was the first splash of color the room had likely seen in years. Outside, she could hear the steady rhythm of a hammer striking glowing steel. Each strike echoed across the valley like the heartbeat of a man who had forgotten there was more to life than work. Back in Willow Creek, people were already wondering how many days this new bride would last. Some guessed a week. Others gave her 3 days. None of them knew Eleanor Brooks. She hadn't crossed half the country to run away from silence. She intended to discover what had hidden itself behind it. The next morning, Eleanor woke before sunrise. The house was still wrapped in darkness, but somewhere beyond the kitchen window she could already hear the familiar ring of metal against metal. Silas had been working for hours. She lit the stove, mixed flour with the last of the fresh butter she had packed from the east, and baked a small loaf of bread. By the time the smell filled the house, the front door opened. Silas stepped inside, brushing the cold morning air from his coat. For the first time since her arrival, he paused. His eyes settled on the loaf resting on the wooden table. "You baked. I thought the house deserved to remember what fresh bread smells like." He looked at the loaf for another second before quietly washing his hands. They ate together in silence. But this silence felt different. It no longer stood between them like a wall. It rested beside them, comfortable enough that neither felt the need to chase it away. After breakfast, Silas disappeared into his workshop. Eleanor spent the morning learning the house. She tightened loose cabinet hinges, mended a torn curtain she discovered folded inside an old chest, and polished the dusty front windows until warm autumn sunlight finally reached the dining table. The house seemed to breathe a little easier. Late that afternoon, a frightened whinny echoed from outside. Eleanor hurried toward the stable. She stopped at the doorway. A young chestnut horse had caught its leg in a broken fence rail. The animal trembled violently. Silas knelt beside it. His large, rough hands moved with remarkable care as he freed the injured leg. "It's all right," he whispered. His voice was barely louder than the wind. "There you go, easy now." The frightened horse slowly relaxed beneath his touch. Eleanor remained unseen behind the doorway. She had expected strength. She had not expected kindness. When Silas finally stood, he noticed her watching. For a brief moment neither of them spoke. "I didn't mean to interrupt," she said softly. "You weren't." He checked the horse one last time before leading it gently back into its stall. That evening, while they ate supper, Eleanor asked only one question. "Will the horse recover?" Silas nodded. "It'll limp for a few days." "I'm glad." He studied her face. "You aren't afraid of animals?" "My father raised them." He gave a single nod. "So you understand." It was the longest conversation they had shared. The following afternoon, the town supply wagon stopped outside the house. The driver unloaded sacks of flour before lowering his voice. "Most folks figured you'd be heading back by now." Eleanor smiled politely. "I've only just arrived." The driver chuckled. The others usually packed before the first week ended. After he left, she found Silas repairing a wagon wheel behind the workshop. "I heard what he said," he admitted without looking up. "They're waiting for you to leave." Eleanor leaned against the fence. "People spend too much time predicting other people's lives." His hammer stopped. He looked at her for a long moment. "You don't seem disappointed." "I wasn't looking for an easy man." She smiled gently. "I was looking for an honest one." Silas lowered his eyes, but something shifted in his expression. Not relief. Not happiness. Something quieter. As the evening settled over Willow Creek, he carried 2 cups of coffee onto the porch instead of only one. He handed one to Eleanor. Their fingers brushed for the briefest moment. It lasted no more than a heartbeat. Yet somehow, it felt like the first real step toward a home neither of them had expected to find. Winter arrived quietly over Willow Creek. The first frost covered the fields like silver dust, and every morning the chimney above Silas Carter's workshop sent a thin ribbon of smoke into the pale sky. Life settled into a rhythm neither of them had planned. Silas still rose before sunrise. Eleanor still baked fresh bread every morning. But somewhere between shared meals and quiet evenings, the house had begun to change. Curtains now framed the windows. A small vase of wildflowers rested in the center of the table. The rooms no longer echoed with emptiness. One afternoon, the sound of wagon wheels climbed the narrow road. Samuel Reed, the town's postmaster, stepped down carrying a small bundle of letters. His eyes wandered around the porch before settling on Eleanor. "I'll admit," he said with a grin, "the whole town lost their bets." Eleanor laughed softly. "Bets? On how soon you'd leave?" She glanced toward Silas, who stood nearby repairing a wooden gate. "And what are they saying now?" Samuel smiled. "Now they're wondering what miracle happened up here." After the postmaster departed, silence returned to the ranch. The afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the yard. Silas continued working for several minutes before quietly setting his tools aside. "I should tell you something." Eleanor looked at him without speaking. "The women before you." His voice slowed. "They didn't leave because they were weak." He stared toward the mountains. "They left because I never made room for anyone." He drew a slow breath. "My father worked every hour after my mother died. I watched him bury himself in responsibility until there wasn't anything left except the work." He lowered his eyes. "I promised myself I'd never become him." A faint, bitter smile crossed his face. "I became exactly like him." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The cold wind drifted through the pine trees. Finally Eleanor stepped closer. "You know what I think?" Silas nodded once. "I think lonely people often mistake closed doors for strong walls." He looked at her. She continued gently. "Broken people don't need perfect homes." She smiled. "They need someone willing to stay." Something inside him gave way. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Simply the quiet surrender of a man who had carried the same weight for far too many years. "I've never thanked you," he said. "For what?" "For seeing more than everyone else did." Eleanor reached for his rough hand. "You made that easy." By early spring, the snow had melted from the hills. The little church in Willow Creek filled with neighbors who could hardly believe what they were seeing. Silas Carter stood at the front wearing his best black coat. For once, his hands trembled. When Eleanor walked toward him, he didn't hide the emotion in his eyes. The ceremony was small. Simple. Honest. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Silas held her hand just a little longer than necessary. Outside, Samuel Reed shook his head with a smile. "I never thought I'd see the day." Silas actually smiled back. Not the faint movement Eleanor had noticed weeks before. A real smile. The kind that reached his eyes. Months passed. The workshop still rang with the sound of iron, but laughter sometimes echoed between the hammer strikes. Bright flowers bloomed beside the front porch. Warm bread cooled on the kitchen table. Neighbors stopped by without hesitation. The lonely house everyone once feared had become the warmest home in Willow Creek. One quiet evening, Silas and Eleanor sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold. Silas looked toward the house before turning to her. "For years," he said softly, "I thought this place was only something I had to protect." He squeezed her hand. "You showed me it was something worth living in." Eleanor rested her head against his shoulder. A house becomes a home the day someone chooses to stay. The last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the hills. The porch lamp glowed warmly against the gathering dusk. Inside the windows danced with soft golden light, carrying the promise of another peaceful evening. For the first time in many years, Silas Carter no longer feared the silence. Because now, he was never alone inside it.